Welcome to FACT's webinar called Managing Internal Parasites for Sheep and Goats, Outsmart the Enemy. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. Our presenter is Linda Coffey. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. So to begin with a few quick introductions, FACT is a national nonprofit organization that's headquartered in Illinois. We promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a number of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers. This webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. Please visit our website to learn more about our other farmer services, including some of the other webinars that we have coming up this winter. So this time I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Linda Coffey, Program Specialist with NCAT and ATTRA. Linda comes from a family farm in central Missouri where they raised cattle, hogs, sheep, and horses. She holds a master's degree in animal science and works primarily on sheep, goat, and multi-species grazing issues. We are incredibly lucky to have her with us today to share her experience and expertise. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Linda so that she may begin her presentation, because I know that she has a lot to cover today. Linda, please take it away.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate with you on this webinar series. I want to go back to just talk a little bit about our nonprofit, the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and we are national. We advocate for small-scale, local, and sustainable solutions to reduce poverty, promote healthy communities, and protect natural resources. And one of the ways that we carry out our mission is through the ATTRA Information Service for farmers. So an information service for all of you listening. We give free technical advice. You can reach us through our 800 number, 800-346-9140. And we have a ton of information available for you at our website, which you see here, attra.ncat.org. And you can reach me and other specialists through email. Our formula is first name, last initial at ncat.org. So Linda C. at ncat.org. Sorry. This is a view of our website. We have a ton of information, as I said, on many, many topics. And I want to call your attention across in the blue bar to the fact that we have webinars, videos, tutorials, and publications. We also have an internship database that's very much used. And I encourage you to use the search bar to look for information or call us. We really like to hear from you. And if you are on Facebook, we'd love for you to like our pages. We have 6 regional offices. Each of us has our own page. The one in headquarters is Montana, the West in California, Southwest in Texas, Northeast in New Hampshire, Southeast is my office in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and the Gulf States office is in Jackson, Mississippi. Also want to tell you that we have a podcast now. That's the icon, and you can get it from our website or from iTunes or something. Last I asked, we had 96 different episodes that have loaded on all different kind of topics. So please check that out too. My name is Linda Coffey. I work for the nonprofit NCAT on the ATTRA project, and I also work on Maple Gorge Farm, which is near Prairie Grove, Arkansas, which is near Fayetteville in the northwest corner of Arkansas. And as Larissa told you, I grew up in Missouri on a farm. I started raising sheep when I was a young girl, and I've been raising sheep pretty much continuously ever since. I love to see healthy animals, sheep and goats. We have alpine dairy goats as well. And so I'm really excited to be talking to you today because I know you feel the same way about healthy animals. Before we get started, I have to give a shout out to the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. Hopefully some of you were on last week and you have checked them out since I told you all about them. I just think this group of researchers and extension people have done so much to help us. All of us farmers who are trying to raise sheep and goats need the information that they get and they do hard research. It's tedious, it's difficult, and then they put it out there on this really nice website for us all to read about. Really, you want to thank Dr. Joan Burke, who has funded a lot of the work that I've done in writing about internal parasites and is a partial funder of this series. Susan Shinian runs the website, and she is excellent. All these other people too. So check out their website, wormx.info. Here's what it looks like. And this is a picture of them doing the FAMACHA technique. I also want to call your attention to the buttons on this website. Topics is a really good one to check out, and resources. And if you want to learn how to do FAMACHA technique, check out the training tab. I think I told somebody last week how you get trained, but there's also an online training that I neglected to mention. So check out wormx.info. This is my favorite of this three-part series. Last week, we talked about parasites and the life cycle and all of the survival strategies that they have that make them such a fierce enemy. But this week, we're going to talk about how we can outsmart them. All these preventive techniques, and the more you use, the better, is, and for those of you who are doing organic production, this is the week for you, because these are the things that are going to make it possible for you to do organic production. Next week, we'll talk about treatment options, and I hope that you can join us for all three. If you didn't join last week, you can pick it up through the archives at FACT, and later on we're going to have them featured on the ATTRA site as well. Why should we spend 3 weeks talking about internal parasites? I'm guessing that all of you realize that it's the worst thing for our small ruminants. Internal parasites can devastate a flock or a herd. And it's especially hard right now because of the fact that so many parasites have adapted to the deworming medications. The dewormers don't work so well anymore. But even when they did, deworming medications were always just a short-term fix. So we want to know all we can to get us through this problem. One of the perks of my job has been the opportunity to go learn things. And in 2003, I got to go to the American Dairy Goat Association Convention and sit in on the continuing education talks from American Association of Small Ruminant Practitioners. Excellent, excellent talks. And I took really good notes. And I want to share 3 quotes from that set of classes. Dr. D.G. Pugh, who went on to write Sheep and Goat Medicine, said, "Dewormers are the worst way to manage internal parasites." I found that startling. Do you? And then Dr. Sharon Patton followed that up by saying, "There are no chemotherapeutic solutions to overstocking pastures or poor husbandry." And she also gave this quote, which I like: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of Panacure." I think that sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today, which is not deworming, but pasture management, immunity, how to support the immune system through sanitation and good nutrition and keeping stress low, and how to assess the immune system so that we can know which animals to choose. So a quick review from last week, the parasite life cycle, and starting at the top, the sheep ingested the parasite larva, and the larvae change and take up residence in the body, and they start doing their damage in the digestive system. Then they reproduce, they lay eggs, which are passed in the feces. When the conditions are right, those eggs hatch, and the larvae move up the blades of grass. And then the animals ingest the larva, and the cycle is repeated. Just like last week, we're going to start by breaking that down. Remember that they're ingesting the parasite larva while they're grazing and near manure, and that the parasite larvae infect specific to the host, mostly, but sheep, goats, llamas, and alpacas share parasites. Cattle and horses do not. So our first line of defense is to minimize the number of larvae ingested. at that part of the life cycle, we're going to do some work here to take care that they don't take in too many larvae. So we're going to give them plenty of good pasture. And we're going to leave at least a 4-inch residue. 6 inches would be better. So we're going to graze tall forage. And strip grazing is a really good way to make sure they don't take in too much larvae. I think of this as giving them a clean plate. So we just open up a little strip. They come in as if it were a feed trough. And notice that they're eating what I want them to eat, and the manure is falling behind them. So strip grazing works really well if you make sure to give them enough, move that fence often. Like I was moving it every day, and it worked really, really well. Grazing annuals is another way to stop from taking in too much larvae. These are turnips. When you do tillage, that will bury some larvae and eggs, and it will let sun hit others, which will kill them. And then you've got to wait while the annuals grow, so that gives more time too. Using browse is a great way to keep them away from larvae because high head, low load. Multi-species grazing, because remember they're specific to the host, and cattle do not share parasites with the goats and vice versa. And remember sanitation. So clean feed troughs. Feeding, if you're going to feed on the ground, only what they'll clean up quickly and then feed someplace else. Clean water tanks, but also think about where you're providing water. When we first had our farm here in Arkansas, we had one place where they had to come back to drink. Well, that caused us to have overgrazing happening all the time near that central point. If you want to prevent them from ingesting too many larvae, I think it's super important that you have water available on the pasture. It's also good from a soil management technique because they're putting the fertility right back in the same pasture instead of moving it. When we had the central watering point, we were mining nutrients from the back of the farm to that central watering point. So clean for sanitation and water available in every pasture. So that's the first line of defense. We're going to minimize how much larvae they bring in by good sanitation, evasive grazing, where we're always leaving 4 inches of vegetation. And remember that not only does that avoid the majority of the parasite larvae, but it lets your grass regrow well. And it protects the soil. You're not leaving it exposed for erosion. We're also going to use browse to stay away from the larvae and multi-species grazing to help clean the pastures of the larvae because it's a dead-end host. Annual crops where it's feasible, and hay regrowth because when you cut hay, then that lets the sunshine come in, let it regrow, and now it's much safer to graze. I want to refer you to ATTRA's Grazing to Control Parasites. This is by my friend and coworker Dave Scott. Really concise. He puts the grazing management down in really clear terms, and you can find it on the ATTRA website. I think we'll email this one to you also. So back to the parasite life cycle. We started at the top and we discussed how we'll stop them from ingesting too many larvae. But some of them are going to get in, and the adults take up residence in the body and they start doing damage to the digestive system. But our animals are not helpless. The second line of defense is the immune system. Animals that are healthy and well-fed and old enough can resist establishment of those larvae, or if they do establish, they can suppress egg laying, so you have less eggs being excreted in the manure. And the immune system will help the animal tolerate the challenge too. So not only is this ewe healthy herself, but she's helping provide a healthier environment for the rest of your flock or herd. I like to imagine the healthy immune system is a strong fighter, like picture with karate moves. It's fighting off one enemy at a time, but too many enemies at once can still take it down. So let's give our animals a chance. Don't let too many enemies come in. Remember, that gets us back to To our first point, don't let too many parasite larvae be ingested, but then also let's support the immune system with good nutrition. All fighters need protein, and they can get this in a lot of ways. You can provide it with good pasture or browse. Soybean meal for lambs, like a 1/4 pound per head per day. One of my first mentors was Dr. C.V. Ross in Missouri. Years ago, he did research that found that if you just supplemented some protein, the lambs did so much better and the parasite loads were reduced. Maybe when pastures are too mature, you might think of protein tubs, a little alfalfa hay or sarisa hay for new mothers when they kid or lamb. These are just some ideas. Not just protein is important, of course, but they also need enough energy and water and minerals. Copper and zinc are known to be important for the immune system. So providing a good mineral mix is one of the ways that we can help our animals stay healthy. Remember that copper can be toxic if it's excessive for sheep. There's a narrow margin there between what they need and what's too much. So be careful about that with sheep. This is a photo I got from Dave Scott. I like how he's providing good nutrition and good sanitation and saving labor with his large flock of sheep in this way of feeding his hay. So again, there's lots of ways you can provide that protein. I like to see my animals have diverse forage. And I don't know if you're like me, I'm loving these pictures from April here in February where everything is gray and gloomy. And not too long, our pastures are going to look just like this. And I like to see diversity. I hate to hear people say that they need to spray their pastures to clean them up. I want as much diversity as possible. You see there's some legumes in there. There's some weeds that probably have some unknown medicinal value, we hope. If they're grazing the weeds, it's not a problem. It's just another forage. So plenty of good forage with lots of diversity will boost intake, which makes for a healthier animal. High tannin forage, Cerisa lespedeza and bird's foot trefoil have both been shown to help with internal parasite load and to boost protein and give bypass protein. So a high tannin forage is another way that you can provide good nutrition. And browse. Now I had that earlier with a way to evade larvae because up high on the plant there is no larva, but also wanted you to realize that browse can be extremely nutritious. At different times of the year, it might be the best thing out there for our animals to eat. So not only is it not getting the larva, it is getting excellent nutrition, digestible, and protein. Just like with our grasses, as it gets more mature, the nutritious it becomes less nutritious, but again, at certain times of the year, it's really, really good stuff. And legumes is a way to boost protein. Here's the high tannin forage Cerisa lespedeza again, but also the cool season legumes, the clovers. And sometimes you just have to supplement. This is what my animals look like now. There's not a good pasture out there. They have hay, but they also need to get enough protein and enough energy. They also need some concentrate right now because remember their nutrient demands are very high. They've had twins, they're making milk, and so we have to take care of supplementing sometimes. Let's think about who needs extra support. Young animals, because they don't get immunity till at least 4 months, usually later, 4 to 6 to 9 months for immunity for lambs. Lambs and kids at weaning time, because that's a stressful time, and when pastures are mature, are going to need some extra help. Now, these lambs don't need extra help. We're providing it for them with this excellent pasture. They're going to be just fine. But we should still be thinking about how to get them to the best pasture and least contamination. Old animals. Maybe their teeth aren't very good. Their immune systems are tired. Let's get some extra TLC for those old girls that have done such a good job for us. And anything that's been sick is going to need a little building up time. Periparturient, we did that term last time. Periparturient animals, those near the birthing time, for a couple of weeks before they give birth and say at least out 2 to 4 weeks after giving birth, they are working so hard. They're giving birth, they're making milk, they're taking care of their babies. Nutritional needs have jacked up, and at the same time, those hypobiotic larvae inside of them are activated. And if we give them extra protein now, that helps their immune system to work and suppress fecal egg numbers. So that lowers pasture contamination and will help us further on into the season. And the mothers will milk better, so the babies will grow better and they will be healthier. Mothers feeding multiples especially are going to need some extra care. So just to review, we're going to support the immune system by minimizing the challenge, back to point 1, with good grazing management and good sanitation. And we're going to strengthen the animals with good nutrition. That again is good grazing management. And we're going to keep the stress low, which I didn't actually mention, but that helps too. And then we are going to figure out which animals are our toughest ones and keep them for breeding. Why? Selection is the best long-term solution to the problem of internal parasites. And if we select animals with low fecal egg counts, that lowers pasture contamination, which helps us right now, and it's a heritable trait. Remember that ewe I showed you? She's healthy herself, she's not contaminating the pasture, and her daughters and sons will tend to be also healthy. 20% of your animals will be harboring about 80% of the worms. This is true for everybody's flock. Research has been done. Someone asked me about Dr. Ray Kaplan's work on this, and he's got a slide which I have he shared with me. I'll show it to you next week. So 20% of your animals will be harboring 80% of the worms. This is really important to know because it's one of the reasons we don't need to deworm everybody. And it's one of the reasons why selecting animals is so important. We got to figure out which of our animals have a very good immune system and which do not. And there's several ways we can do that. One is to use the FAMACHA system. Remember that only works for the barber pole worm. You see me doing this in the upper photograph. You push, pull, pop, and get the color matched with the card to see whether it's anemic or not. So an anemic animal has an infestation of barber pole worm. So one that's not anemic is what we're looking for. Remember, barber pole worm is a summer parasite mostly. And so during some times of the year, like now, I would not expect to see anemic animals yet. A way to check for animals that are not infected in other parts of the year includes the 5-point check. We went over that last time too. It includes looking at the eyes, the body condition, the condition of the coat, whether or not they are scoured, and in the official one, it looks at the jaw, looking for bottle jaw. Fecal egg counts are a much more precise way to check the status of your animals. But again, at this time of the year, if they're hypobiotic, your animal could be loaded up with parasites, but not be having any eggs come out in the manure. So fecal egg counts don't tell you how many worms they have, they tell you how many egg-laying worms they have. And barber pole worms lay the most eggs. So an animal that's infected with a different kind of parasite may have much lower fecal egg counts, but still be pretty sick. If that makes sense. Now, what about production records? If you use an index, I think that can help. The reasoning is this. An animal that's infected with internal parasites can't grow so fast because of the damage being done in the digestive systems. They're not going to do as well. They're not going to grow as fast. So in theory, if you were weighing your animals and you had an animal that was gaining better, that one has less internal parasites. But remember, we have to use an index here. Otherwise, we're favoring single births. And I also want to say in the milk producers, my dairy goats, I have noticed, a high producing animal will have more trouble with parasites because of nutritional stress. So sometimes a parasite load is an indicator of a need for better nutrition, not necessarily an animal that doesn't have a good immune system. This is just a very fast review. The symptoms that you see with internal parasites, and this poor goat, with its legs tucked under it, and it's very thin, and it's got a scruffy coat. Its head is down, it's depressed, its tail is down, and there is fecal matter on the end of that tail, indicating that it has scoured at some point. It does not feel good. It needs help. And remember, we talked about all of them are going to be kind of slow moving and lay off by themselves, but a barber pole worm will cause the animal to have anemia because barber pole is a bloodsucker, and they may have bottle jaw. If they're not barber pole worm, then we might see diarrhea, scours, and that's true for coccidiosis also. If you want to learn how to do the FAMACHA test, click in there. You see this wormx.info website page. Go into the training button up there on the left. It's easy to learn. It's so helpful. Saves a lot of money and helps you figure out which animals in your flock or herd are the strongest. This is what I think is one of the very best uses of FAMACHA, because barber pole worm is our big deal most of the year. And this is how we can know which animals we want to keep. It's just a review about 5-point check, where we use our eyes and our hands. And some of it, as I told you, can be done from a distance, in that you can look at the coat, you can look at the tail, you can get some sense of the liveliness, but you need to get in close and feel of your animals, find that body condition score. I don't care if you use a number or not, just know that we're shooting for some fat cover over that body. And that will change with time through the year when we talk about that. Also want to just tell you, 5-point check is a real thing invented in South Africa. I didn't put the official little symbol up here because I don't do the official one. Instead of jaw and nose, I'm using coat or wool and energy and vitality instead. But you can read all about 5-point check on the consortium website, and I encourage you to do that. This is just, I'll save some time. I did this last week. You can see that this animal has beautiful shine. She was very alert. Her posture's good. Her tail was clean. Under her eyes, she was not anemic. She was a FAMACHA score of 1. She has a little swelling under her jaw, but it's not bottle jaw. It's milk goiter, and which is not unexpected in a nursing kid that's healthy. So here's an animal that I think has a beautiful body condition score. Not too thin, not too fat. She's nice. I do want to mention that she's also not working hard. She has not kidded. This is the winter time, and her condition should change if she was milking and nursing twins. She ought to lose a little bit of weight. But this animal is too thin, and by the coat, I don't think she's quite in tip-top condition, see some roughed up coat. She is nursing. She probably needs a little better feeding than she's getting. She's too thin. But I don't like to see this either. If you all have animals that are this pudgy, stop feeding them so much. It's not a healthy condition for them. They'll be tough to get to settle, and if they do, they may have kidding problems, and I don't want to see our animals fed so much. So we've talked about FAMACHA, and we talked about the 5-point check and using those to decide who needs to be dewormed. Doing fecal egg counts, as I said, is more precise. It needs to be the quantitative, so the McMaster's fecal egg count, and you can learn that through the Langston website. We'll send that link. It's good for monitoring pasture contamination, but you got to get a pooled sample, and we'll show you some numbers to get an idea of why that is. It's good for testing for dewormer resistance. This is super important, and Dr. Bill Shulaw suggested that if you're only going to do it once a year, because it is a bit tedious, do it in mid to late summer to see if the dewormers are still working against the barber pole worm. And here's how you do it. You take a sample of an animal that needs to be dewormed. and you get it done with the McMasters. Then you deworm, and then 7 to 10 days later, maybe up to 14, but not any later, you test again. And what you want to see is a 95% reduction in fecal egg count. Next week, I'll put on a slide the exact formula, but you do the pre-deworming number minus the post-deworming number divided by the pre-deworming number times 100. So just for example, if you had 2,000 eggs per gram the first time, and after deworming you had 100 eggs per gram, that's going to come out to a 95% reduction. If you don't have a 95% reduction, you may have some resistant parasites that have resistance to the anthelmintic. It gets confusing, doesn't it? Find out which of your animals are resistant by fecal egg counts. And you do that by looking at more than one. I'll show you what I mean. Another way to get some great information besides the fecal egg counts with the McMasters is the Drench Rite assay. This is done at the University of Georgia in Dr. Ray Kaplan's lab, and it answers two questions. What parasites does my flock or herd have, and which drugs are effective on my farm? We'll talk about this more next time, but a lot of drugs don't work on a lot of farms. It'd be good to know what your situation is. So you can get the information at wormex.info on how to get that Drench Rite assay done. They recommend that you do it every couple of years just to keep knowing what your status is. So let's define a couple of terms that are important for selection. Resistance is when the animal can stop internal parasites from establishing. And if they do establish, can suppress egg production. So stops them from establishing or suppresses egg production, that's resistant animal. A resilient animal doesn't necessarily stop them from establishing, but somehow is able to tolerate a parasite burden, and it remains apparently healthy in spite of infection. So what this looks like is a resistant animal will have a low fecal egg count, because remember, they're not letting them establish, they're not letting them lay eggs, and they will not be anemic because there's no parasites in there to make them anemic. They won't have any symptoms of infection because they really are healthy. A resilient animal, though, doesn't have symptoms of infection and doesn't show anemia, but they might actually be shedding some eggs, contaminating some pastures. So for our purposes, it'd be better to have a resistant animal than a resilient one. But we have to take into account also challenge. So let's add this in. Because if you have no challenge on your farm, you will still have low fecal egg counts, no anemia, and no symptoms of infection. And you might think you've got resistant animals. When you add in a challenge and you have a susceptible animal, now you might have high fecal egg counts and anemia if it's barber pole worm, and other symptoms of infection. But listen, if you get a very high challenge, you can still overwhelm even a strong immune system. And you might still see some symptoms of infection and anemia and have a high fecal egg count. Thing is, it won't happen as fast with an animal that has some natural toughness with their immune system. Still, I want you to remember this. With a really high challenge, you can even make a strong immune system sick. Excuse me. So Dr. Bill Shulaw in Ohio presented these numbers in a Shepherd article some years ago, and I really like this because it teaches us some things. Remember, from egg to egg, under ideal conditions, it only takes 21 days for barber pole worm, okay, to complete its whole cycle. So you have a group of lambs here, and they did fecal egg counts, and the average on May 14th was 0. And then the next week it was 42 eggs per gram, extremely low, and 89 eggs per gram. And at that point, you might have been thinking, we've got a good group of animals here with strong immune systems. But in fact, they hadn't been challenged yet. See what happened the next week? 1,050. And the next week, almost doubled. So the lesson here is we can't just become complacent. If we look at what's happening early in the season, especially if you're further north, if you look at what's happening early in the season, you may think you've got it made. You need to keep paying attention because it can get to a dangerous level in just a couple of weeks. There's another study that I think teaches us something really good. 46 lambs averaged 3,800 eggs per gram. But in that group, 21 of them had under 1,000. And the top 4 animals had over 20,000. That is a lot of variation. 2 animals in that group of 46 had 0 eggs per gram. So if you were doing a fecal egg count and you just wanted to know what was going on with your flock, I don't think you could just choose one and get an accurate picture, do you? This is why when you're taking a fecal egg counts to see what your pasture contamination is, you have to get a group sample. But I would like to know which animals had over 20,000 and which had 0. And then we'd be selecting for those animals with the lower counts because they've all been challenged the same. Does that make sense? Another thing, why you must manage grazing. I said earlier, dewormers are a short-term fix. They collect samples 30 days after deworming and the average fecal egg count greater than 2,000 eggs per gram, not because the dewormer didn't work, but because they kept grazing a contaminated pasture. So unless we're managing grazing, our animals can be sick again very quickly. We really want to pay attention when we're selecting rams or bucks. And again, if we're looking for resistance, the way to tell that is with low fecal egg counts when there's a challenge. Resistance or resilience, FAMACHA or 5-point check can tell us that, or high animal performance in the face of challenge. Now, when we see a good FAMACHA score, and I always like to see a good FAMACHA score, but again, unless you have other information, all you know is this animal is not anemic. You don't know why. Is it resistant? Maybe, or it might be resilient, or it might not have been challenged. So that's why it's important to look at what's happening in the whole group. The National Sheep Improvement Program has estimated breeding values for fecal egg counts for Katahdin and Polypay breeds. And if you raise one of those breeds, I think it's really important that you try to support those breeders who participate and select sires that can help your flock improve rapidly. People whose breeds aren't doing this, we might be thinking it might be a great way to improve our breeds quickly. But even if we're not doing that, we should all be selecting for better parasite resistance. It's just really important for the future of sheep and goat production. And I want to talk about breeds because I get asked, what about breeds that are resistant? There are breeds with known resistance, and I said this last week. They became that way by survival of the fittest, by being grown in challenging conditions without much care, like the Gulf Coast sheep, which I raise there on the left, which was just turned loose in Louisiana pine woods and round up once a year. If they lived, they lived. And if they didn't, they didn't. Over time, that breeds a very tough animal. But remember, even animals with good immunity can be hit with too much challenge. And remember, there's more variation within a breed than between. I've got here a Gulf Coast ewe and a Suffolk ewe. Suffolks are not known for their parasite resistance, but both of these ewes were working for us on our farm. There is a lot of variation in the breed you raise too. And if you will select those stronger animals within your breed, you can make great progress. And so I want to encourage you to do that. Remember, it's the best long-term solution that we have. Like I said, there's a lot of variation between the breeds. These are both boar goats, and there's a world of difference in what you see. And I'm not just picking on the boars. I went to Oklahoma a few years ago to look at their pastured buck test, and the best bucks on that test were Kikos. And the ones that got sent home because they were too sick were also Kikos. all that to say, let's don't put our faith in what breed we're raising. Let's keep looking at the individuals within our breed and selecting the best. And let's make parasite resistance be part of our criteria. So ATTRA Publications, which I encourage you to check out, Tools for Managing Internal Parasites in Sheep and Goats, Animal Selection, and Simple Genetic Selection Strategies to Manage the Barber Pole Worm. I think we'll send you these links later too. So we have covered immunity, and we've covered keeping them from taking in too many larvae. Now let's go back to our parasite life cycle and let's finish the loop. So adults that are not suppressed by the immune system will lay eggs, which are passed in the feces. Remember, more animals, more manure, more eggs. And those eggs hatch and the larvae move in moisture. And here comes our third line of defense. And it's going to remind you a lot of the first one. First, we're going to minimize ingestion of the larvae, and then we're going to support the immune system. Now, we're going to move away from the contamination. All that manure that got put on our pasture, we're going to move away from that within 4 days in the summer. Why? Because they laid some eggs onto the pasture on day 1, and it could hatch into infective larvae within 4 days in the summer if there's moisture. So we're not going to be there. We're going to move away from it so that our animals are not ingesting the larvae. And then we're not going to come back to that pasture for as long as we can. 35 days would be minimum. Longer is way better. In Oklahoma, Dr. Steve Hart found that 60 days was pretty good for the goats. Really lowered infection rate if they could give the larvae time to hatch and die. And in the summer, remember, their metabolism revs up and they will die faster. In cold weather, they live for a very, very long time. And it's hard to give our pastures that much rest time. And in 2 months, the pasture quality really, really has suffered because of maturity. It's not as high in protein and it's not as digestible either. So here's some ways that we can extend our rest time to give a safer grazing to our animals and not lose too much nutrition. So multi-species grazing, we've talked about that. One way you could do this, let's say you have cattle and sheep. You could graze with sheep, take them off, let it regrow, now graze with cattle. When the cattle take in the larvae, remember it's a dead-end host. Then let it regrow and you can come back with the sheep. That's a way to use the pasture, let it regrow, and come back. You could use land off the farm. We do this. We've got a neighbor that lets us graze in the summertime. It's awesome for giving our land a little rest. And he likes having his pastures kind of cleaned up. Dave Scott in Montana grazes leafy spurge in the summer with his ewes. Maybe you've got a neighbor who has cattle and the weeds and brush are growing up. You could do them a favor and yourself a favor at the same time if you could work out a deal. You could plant some annuals to provide clean pasture. Again, you could cut a hay crop, let it regrow and then graze it. But remember, we always want to leave at least a 4-inch residue. And if your pastures have not regrown enough because of drought, whatever, it's really better to put them in dry lot and give them hay rather than have them grazing down too short. And I didn't say this earlier. I don't remember if I have a picture that will let me talk about it easily. But it's pretty hard to control sheep so that they don't grow shorter than 4 inches. The only way I know to do it is to put them in a pretty small area, get them, manage their grazing so that they're in there just for a short time and they can graze it fairly evenly. If you give them a big area for a long time, they're going to spot graze. And you've all seen this. They're going to get it right down to the ground in places and leave tall tufts in others. The way to fix that is to manage the grazing so that you keep them in a smaller area. I wonder how many of you use electric fence. If you did the quiz earlier, I wasn't watching, and I was wondering about that because if you have electric fence, that really helps with using electronet or something so you can confine your animals more closely and control their grazing. That managed grazing tutorial that I've talked about, hey, thanks for the thumbs ups. Those are cool. The managed grazing tutorial that I've spoken about will help figure out not only how to get away from the parasites and provide good nutrition, it's just going to help you build your soil too. Terry Hutchens in Kentucky has thought up these blocks for goats, and it makes a really good example to think about. How are some ways that you can provide great nutrition while also avoiding contaminated areas? So in each one of these, he has designed a block that you could move through with rotational grazing. Like, remember, you're still going to obey those rules of not staying in one place too long. And ATTRA's Managed Grazing tutorial will help you learn to do this. So his blocks are winter annuals, browse, perennial pastures, summer annuals, perennial legumes. Let's go through these real fast. So winter annuals, where you plant in the fall and you graze in early spring. So you're disrupting the larva by doing that planting. And you graze that in early spring. And when that's about done, you're going to be in browse, when it's fully leafed out. You're going to take only a third to a half of the leaves, and then you're going to let it rest till next year. This picture is to help you remember why. This is in April, some years back in Arkansas, one of my neighbors. You see the fence line contrast there. On the right-hand side, I see a bunch of buckbrush. It's very lush. It's perfect for goats. It's very nutritious too. The numbers would show it's very high in protein, very digestible. On the left is where the goats have been for a year with no rest, and they have hammered it. I don't know if that browse is going to recover. I mean, it will with time. But what they've got left is not much. They don't have enough left there to eat. So those animals are not getting enough nutrition, and they have probably killed off their feed source. Since browse is so good for our animals because it keeps them away from the parasite larvae, because at times of the year it's extremely nutritious, I like to keep it as a resource on my farm, but you can't do that if you let them have full access. So let's remember, don't let them take it all, and then let's let it rest a long time. It takes a lot longer to rest than grasses do. And when they're done with that, then you move to perennial pastures, but by now it's late enough in the season that you could have grazed it first with cattle or cut it for hay and let it regrow. And that's how you're going to avoid the larvae that overwintered on that pasture. When they're done with that block, then you can go to maybe summer annuals. Again, you've done a tillage operation, and corn, soybeans, sun hemp, sorghum, Sudan grass, these are just all ideas. Cowpeas, let them get tall, and then when you graze it down, leave enough residue so that it can regrow if it rains. So you can stay on that for a while, and then move to perennial legumes, like maybe Cerisa lespedeza. Cerisa lespedeza grows well on porous soils and in acid conditions. And again, the tannins are helpful in suppressing worms. Their eggs don't hatch so much, and it kills some of the worms in the animal. It's not the only thing you have to do. And if they stay on nothing but Cerisa for too long, they can get into mineral imbalances. So again, diversity helps them eat more. One way you can use Cerisa is to give them access as they want it. Cattle don't really like Cerisa, but the sheep and goats like it fine. I have rested this a long time to get it this tall to put them in. And don't graze Cerisa too short, because that's one. My husband did a clipping study some years ago and tried to see what would happen if you cut it down 2 inches from the ground. If you cut it that short and then it doesn't rain, the plant will die. So let's leave 4 to 6 inches there. Well, what we just went through, I mean, nobody's going to copy that exactly, but some of those ideas might work on your farm. And think about your farm goals and your resources, and plan some kind of system that will help you to stay away from the parasites and nourish your animals well. And if your pastures are always too short, then you are overstocked. Dr. D.G. Pugh said back in 2003 that if you have enough forage on your farm for your animals, then you're stocked right. In other words, if you need hay in the winter, you should be able to cut that on your own farm. And he said, if you have more animals than that, if you're having to buy in hay, then you are overstocked. Well, that's pretty disheartening for those of us on a farm that doesn't have great soil resources. We do buy in hay and we're building our soil. But the point is, if you're overstocked, your animals are more likely to get sick. And you have to address that root cause. Now, in some areas, the only way you're going to raise small ruminants and avoid internal parasites on a small acreage is to feed them in a pen. You got to think about what it costs, think about your values, what do you want, and remember that these are ruminant animals. But Susan Shinian says in Maryland, she's run the numbers. In some areas where land is expensive, that is a very good way to raise animals and have them be healthy. All right, you guys have been so patient. Thank you. Let's wrap it up. The first line of defense was to limit exposure. Don't let them take in larvae. Good sanitation. And then the second line of defense is to support the immune system, again with good sanitation, not taking in too much larvae, but good nutrition, plenty of protein, plenty of energy, water, minerals, and select the strongest animals to make your flock better over time. And the third line of defense was to move away from contamination before the eggs hatch and then stay away to give them time to die, to limit exposure. If we can do these things, pasture management and animal selection, that's how we're going to win this war. I told you about Dr. D.G. Pugh, and let me finish his quote. Deworming is the worst way to manage parasites, but often we have to resort to it. Sometimes our prevention techniques are just not enough, and we are going to have to know how to treat. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, so please come back. This is my short list of resources. Since I've had you on here so long, I'm not going to talk about it this time. We're going to send these links to you. These are the ones I really think you should check out. And then I like to give homework because I think it helps you really take in the message. Use the assessment on the back of the ATTRA's Tips for Managing Internal Parasites. It's just got a checklist with prevention strategies, and just check off how many of them are you already using. Remember, more is better. And then decide if there's some new ones that you might use this season. There are 2 other papers I really like you to read if you have a chance. Managing Internal Parasites in Sheep and Goats by Margot Hale is really concise, good overview. And Managing Internal Parasites in Sheep and Goats Success Stories, I put them both here in writing so you would know. That's 2 different papers. That one is the story of 3 different farmers who have had a train wreck on their place and have used management techniques to now get to where they're successful with their sheep and goats, and you will really enjoy that. It's also very short. All right, thank you so much. I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. I hope that some of my pretty pictures helped make up for your frustration there. So, all right, thank you, Larissa.
Thank you, Linda. I know I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I don't know if, Linda, you have time for a couple questions, or should we save those for next week?
I have time if they have time.
Okay, so let's keep it to about 5 minutes. I know there are a couple that came in, but thank you so much for everyone hanging in there. And thank you, Linda. I think this worked out really well once we got through the technical issues. So question about liver flukes. Is there a best way to check for them? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Whoever asked that question, can you come back next week? Liver flukes is not something I have any experience with, but I will find out. And I will put a slide in about liver flukes in the next one.
Perfect.
Will that work for you?
That would be perfect.
You want to know how to check for them, right?
Check
how to know if you have them.
Yes, and prevent them as possible.
Well, prevent one is stay out of wet areas, if I'm not mistaken, fence off away from snails, but I will check into that. Yes.
Thank you for that, Linda. So another question about manure with eggs are ingested in winter, will the eggs develop into larvae inside the animal, infecting them? I know that
No,
we spoke a little bit about this last week and this week, but okay.
no, that's not how it works. Um, but and I've been talking with my friends at the consortium this week. Probably when I said my animals were in trouble right now, it wasn't really from eggs hatching because we're getting those warm spells, but then really cold. And really cold is going to kill the homunculus. Okay, it's not going to kill the ones that are sheltering down in the soil, though. So, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was your question?
No, it was just about ingesting over the
No,
winter.
eating manure, no.
Okay.
But I
Yeah.
think those dirty feed troughs, though, if there are some larvae that have gotten on there and they lick them up, I think that is definitely a way that they could get trouble with coccidia.
So here's a question that's kind of related. Is there an ideal or natural way to sanitize food and water tubs?
Well, sunlight is your friend. Clean is your friend. No disinfectant works if something is dirty. So just a scrub brush and some water will really help. That's the most natural thing I know of. And sunshine, the ultraviolet light kills the bugs and germs. It's a good disinfectant. I have used like a dilute solution of bleach, but I'm not sure. Somebody says white vinegar. I mean, it wouldn't hurt. Mm-hmm. Something with some acidity.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay, so the last one I'm going to get to right now is, can you talk a bit about managing parasites in relation to bedding practices in a barn?
In the barn. Well, one thing is try to keep it dry because the parasites don't do well with dry. They love moisture. And one thing to think about, all right, I've got my ewes and they're nursing lambs and they go into the barn. If it's filthy and it's wet and they lay down, think about what their teats are like when they stand back up. And then the nursing lambs latch onto that. So to help our lambs be healthier, we need to have our barn be as dry as we can. And I know that's not easy, but if you've got bedding and you keep adding it, that's one way. We've actually used a dirt pack pretty successfully. Like the moisture kind of drains out of that quicker. And so that stays dry. Dry. I was taught when I was lambing out in Idaho that if you kneel down and your knees get wet, that's bad for your animals. It needs more bedding.
It's kind of a good easy test to do.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, I know that we didn't get to everyone's questions this week. I know some of them are related to the presentation next week, so please tune back in. I do have just a few housekeeping items to share before we sign off officially today. Immediately after this webinar, there is a very brief survey, and if you could take a minute or two to give us your feedback about your experience, including the delay, that's fine, and the content, and any ideas for improvements in the future and or other webinars that you'd like to see presented, that would be wonderful.
Yes. And like I'm really sorry about the delay. We will test again early next time.
Yes, I think I know, and Linda, actually, I think I know what happened, so I think we'll be fine. Also, a recording, of the webinar in the slides will be available soon. These documents will be on our website, and I'm going to email them to you all tomorrow, or maybe even later today, depending on when the recording is processed, and links. There's a whole slew of links that Linda has to share with you. And like I mentioned, we do have lots more coming up this winter webinars. That is, our third and final session about internal parasites is next week, so please join us. Linda will be back to cover treatment protocols and strategies, and then to kind of talk through everything that, all the strategies that were discussed throughout the series. And I will note that even if you did register for this webinar or any of the prior ones, that you will need to submit a separate registration for next week's webinar, because you aren't automatically signed up for it due to some privacy issues. And I will send a link to that in the follow-up email. So on that note, I am afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your patience and understanding, and your dedication and interest in this really important topic. And thank you to you, Linda, for your really wonderful presentation. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you, and I look forward to the next installment next week. I certainly hope that everyone will be able to join us for a future webinar and that you have a wonderful afternoon. Please stay safe and warm and enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.